Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Unstuck podcast. I am your host, Damien Harper, as usual, and welcome to episode 61 of the podcast. If you are a new fan, because you will be a fan by the time you finish listening to this, the podcast where we help creators pursue their passion and give you practical advice in order to launch your ideas and to just anything to do with like pursuing your passion, whether it be career, whether it be business, whether it just be like self-motivation and all this kind of stuff. Everything under the sun, as long as it helps you, you're going to find it here. Use the use the hashtag Unstuck podcast, and if you are on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button so that you do not miss an episode if you prefer to watch it on video. So what's today's topic going to be? It's going to be quite a quick episode because it's just me. It's a solo episode. And I'm going to cover something that is quite important. And I'm going to do it quite quickly because I have a place to go right after this. And two, I do not want my camera battery to run out because I can't remember if I charged it. So it'll be very awkward if this cuts out. So while this thing is running, I am going to try and talk to you about choosing a good brand name. What is a brand name and why is it so important? Well, a brand name is super important because it leaves a lasting legacy. It helps people recognize you when they can't see you, and it helps people talk about you when you've had a good service, they've experienced like a good service, for example, or you've done something memorable. And you have to kind of picture this. Imagine you meet someone and you ask them, what's your name? And they're like, I don't have a name. That's really weird, isn't it? So if you have like a business that you're starting, or for yourself, if you need like a name for your YouTube channel, for example, or for your podcast, it's important not to put off having a good name. Don't just pick a random name, because take it from me, as someone who has changed the name of his podcast about 3 times now, it took me a long time to settle on the name The Unstuck Podcast. And I could only settle on the name The Unstuck Podcast when I knew exactly what I was trying to offer to my listeners and how I was trying to serve them. So that's what your name represents. And having a good brand name is very, very important, because when you're doing really great work, you do not want a crappy name. You want a name that feels good. You want a name that, people are excited to say and people want to say, So in this thing, I'm going to talk about what makes a good brand name and examples of good brand names and all that kind of stuff. If you have any questions about this while you're listening to this, why not tweet me? You can tweet me and find me at _Damien Harper on all my platforms, and just ask any question. And obviously my contact details are always in the description. So why am I talking about this? I recently, I do coaching work for like creative entrepreneurs and all that kind of stuff. And I was doing something for a friend of mine, and I spoke to him about, his business name. I was like, okay, so he had a name that he had chosen for the business name. And I was like, okay, so we're doing branding here. So what does your name actually mean? And he said, I just made up the word. I'm like, what do you mean you made up the word? He goes, yeah, it just sounds nice. So I made up the word. It doesn't actually mean anything. And that's when I was just like, dude, you got to change the name. Because that doesn't represent anything. If someone's going to say it, it's just like, okay. Like, it might sound nice, but it doesn't really represent anything. So that's probably the first lesson in this episode, is not to make up a word if it doesn't represent anything. So that's one of the examples of why a name is very important, because all the biggest brands that we can think of, the Coca-Colas, Disney, and all that kind of stuff, they mean something. And these names are very memorable. For example, Disney, it's Walt Disney. It's something as simple as that, Even if you're just going to use your surname, if you have a very like unique surname or a combination of surnames that you can use, like for your mother's maiden name and your dad's surname or something like along those lines, even that's better than just making up a word. You see what I mean? Because that tells a story too, which I'm going to get onto. But this is why a brand name is super important, because A, it makes you memorable. B, it lasts for generations. Lasts a long time. Walt Disney is going to last to the end of time. When you think Disney, you think everything that comes underneath Disney. And when you think Disney, you think of Walt Disney, the person who came up with the whole thing. And you think about his story and where he started with like Steamboat Willie and all that kind of stuff. Even before that, you know, there was a rabbit that he Oswald the rabbit. Even back then, you know, there's a lot of historical meaning behind the word Disney. So you want that kind of feeling in your brand name. And I think the brand name is something that people put off quite a lot because they don't feel like it's as important. But a brand name is just as important as everything else you do. It's just as important it's just as important as you getting a nice logo, or you getting a nice website, or you doing like your target audience, like the research, if they're market research. It's just as important, you know, having a good brand name, because it seals the deal. You know, like believe me, I've spoken to quite a few people who want to start an idea or want to start a business, and they don't have a name. They're like, I don't actually have a name for it yet. Not even an idea for a name. They don't have a name yet, which is okay, which is actually absolutely fine if you are willing to do the work. But you want to do the work, but you don't have a name yet. And even legally, when you have to register as a business, you need a name. So don't put it off. And again, take it from me, because I changed my name so many times. If you end up having to keep changing your name, that's very confusing for your audience as well. So, because this podcast started as the OJ Harper podcast, and then it went into the Demi Harper podcast, and then I settled on the Unstuck podcast, you know. So yeah. So moving on. There are a few points that I would like to make about a brand name, and then we're going to get onto exactly how to have a brand name, to choose a good brand name. So a good brand name has a strong foundation. So you don't want to build anything on sand. You want to build it on a strong foundation, right? You want to build it on rich, strong soil, so that you can, you know, I'm getting biblical here. I kind of preach it here, but you want it to be able to grow. You want the idea to grow. You want it to bear fruit and all that kind of stuff. You want it to be enriching. So a brand name has to have a strong foundation, meaning you got to do your branding. You have to get your branding sorted. You have to look at your vision and your mission and your audience and your values. And that's what your brand name has to represent. It represents all the above in your branding. So even if you haven't chosen a name yet, go and get your branding sorted. And again, I do not mean a logo. I do not mean design. I mean getting your branding, as in your positioning, your gut feeling, that gut feeling that you want someone to have about you. Get that sorted first, because that's going to actually clear the way and make it clear what direction your brand name should go into. You know, so if your brand is actually a lot more informal and a lot like wacky, you're going to have a wacky name. But if your brand is a lot more formal and you're talking more to corporate businesses and stuff like that, you need a name that is going to you know, be memorable for those types of people. But if it's just your personal brand, also if you have a personal brand, you can give yourself a different name. Even like musicians, they don't always use their real name. So like, and actors and writers, they don't always use their real name. They sometimes have a pen name, you know, so you can have an alias. What do you want people to remember you as, right? So a very good example of this, a name with a very strong foundation that encapsulates all the values of that company is Lego. I've mentioned this before in my previous episodes. Lego literally means play well in Danish, to play well. And that just captures exactly what Lego is about, because Lego is no longer just this thing about a toy. It's more than that. It's more than kids putting together buildings and stuff. Adults use Lego to build like landscapes and castles and replicas of like Star Wars, Star Destroyers and all that kind of stuff. And even their movies, like they can do more than the toy. And that's why their branding is so important, because it literally means play well. So they play well no matter what they're doing. I saw a thing recently on a YouTube channel of they're doing bonsai trees to use as decoration in your house. You can build a bonsai tree out of Lego. It sounds crazy, but you know, it's more than just a toy. It means play well. And that's what their Lego literally means. And it captures everything. So your name's got to capture all your values as a brand. And moving quite quickly, a good brand name also tells a story. And what I mean by telling a story is that you can picture what they're trying to say, what kind of message they're trying to give in that name. So for example, Apple is literally about knowledge and rebellion. And the story that comes behind that represents is when an apple fell on Isaac Newton's head or whatever happened. That's when he thought of the concept, that helped him think of the concept of gravity, right? That's the one story that's telling. The other story is telling is about the story in the Garden of Eden where they ate the apple, or they ate the fruit, yeah? And that's why there's a bite in their logo, but we're not talking about logos, but the apple represents both knowledge, inspiration, and rebellion. So Apple always does some weird stuff. Like, for example, if I could had it next to me, I would show you. But the wireless mouse on Apple is people look at it and they're like, that's the worst design product that they have. But I heard somewhere that it's like, okay, but if they didn't, because basically you can't charge the mouse while you're using it because the charging port is at the bottom of the mouse. So you can't actually, when it's plugged in, you can't actually use the mouse. And I heard somewhere that, I don't know if this is true, but if it's true, it'll make sense. They said that that's one of the main complaints about the Apple mouse, the wireless mouse. And they said that basically if you can charge it while using it, it's not truly wireless. So they want it to be truly wireless. So therefore you can't use it while it's charging. And that's the reason why it has that bad design. Well, for me, I'm just like, okay, is it really that deep? But for some people, it's that deep. So that's rebellion. Again, the AirPods are rebellious as well. The fact that they only use USB-C on their MacBooks now is rebellion. Always rebellion. Rebellion, knowledge, and inspiration and creativity. So Apple represents that. They're not saying computers, although they're a computer company. They're not saying computers. They're saying Apple. Interesting. Also, Nike. What does Nike have to do with sports? And I know people say Nike. It's Nike. It's Nike, bruv. Stop saying Nike. It's Nike. It's bad. Don't say Nike. It's bad grammar. It's Nike. And it's not Nike. It's Nike. Right? Nike is the Greek goddess of victory. Now sit on that for just a moment. That has nothing to do with shoes. That has nothing to do with sports. It's talking about victory. That's the story it's telling. It's saying, it's basically Nike represents, it's something that is divine, if you see what I mean. It's a divine name. So when you think about Nike, you're thinking about victory. You're not thinking about sports necessarily. You're thinking about victory. And that's the story that it's trying to tell. And it's also telling the story of like, this thing is meant to last a long time. It's legacy because it's a Greek goddess. It's almost legendary. That's the story that Nike is telling. So when you pick a name, try and tell a story. Try and think of the story that you're trying to tell and pick a word that represents that, or a name. The next point is a good brand name is memorable. That's why I say don't rush it. Just don't rush it. Like, take your time to think of a good brand name and make sure that it's not too long and make sure it's not too short. It's got to roll off the tongue. It's got to feel good to say. If it's too long, it's not going to work it's not going to be memorable because people have to go on the website and go on the URL and type in the name of the thing. And if the name of your business is too long, like, I don't know, Robert Smith Electrical Services. That's long. No one's going to write that in the URL. That is long. That might be the name for your business, but I am not going to type that into a URL. And it's not very unique anyway. But if it's too long, people are going to not remember it. So, and also it doesn't have to be too short. I think one of the main reasons when it's too short is that just off like my intuition, I feel like that name is already going to be taken. But that's just me. But the main thing is that it's got to roll off the tongue and it's got to be easy to remember. So this is probably the shortest episode I'm ever going to do. What is the process of choosing a good brand name, right? When you're trying to come up with a good brand name, what's the process? What exactly is the process of having nothing that represents your brand to something that you've chosen and you're putting it on t-shirts, you're putting it on your website, you're telling people this is the name of my business, or this is my name, this is my brand name. Like, how do you go from nothing to something? this is what I'm gonna do. This is what I would normally say is that you have got to do your branding. So the friend I was talking about earlier, I helped him do his branding first. I told him to choose a name based on the branding, and he chose a name, and it works for him, and it means something. So, so you need to do your branding first. That means you need to talk about that gut feeling, all the stuff that I've talked about in previous episodes. You need to do all that work. You need to do the homework before choosing a brand name, before choosing a final brand name anyway. And after you've done all of that, right, you need to brainstorm the words that represent your values. And I don't mean just 5 words. I mean like 50 odd words at least. Just get a pen and paper and just brainstorm. In the center, just say my brand or whatever. And in each stem, just say words that represent your values. So if your value is about charity, for example, or kindness, right? What words represent kindness? Yeah, I said charity. What other words represents kindness? There's goodness, you know. There's giving. There's gift. All those kind of words, you know. It's patience. These different words that represent the values that you have, write them all down, as many as you can. Don't stop until you literally can't think of something else. And then you're going to start seeing like you're going to get more. The more you write, the more creative you're going to get with the words. So you need to keep writing these words, nouns, adjectives, adverbs, whatever stuff to describe your values or to name your values. Just keep writing them down. And when you've written enough down, what I want you to do is to circle your best options, right? And don't circle a whole bunch of them, just a few. Like up to 5 max, I would say. And circle the best options, the ones that look good and you're like, okay, I like the direction that this is going. And narrow it down. And then what I want you to do also is to, when you've circled all your best options, find other ways to say them. There are different ways to say the same thing. It's like, for example, forward, right? The word forward there are different ways to say forward. There's catapult. There's progress. There's propel. You know, there are different ways to describe, different words to use to describe the same word that sound a lot more interesting. So try and find those words and write those down next to them. And then eventually you're going to narrow it down to just 2 or 3 kind of names. One tip that if you're stuck, get a thesaurus or go online to a thesaurus website and try and find synonyms of those words. So again, if, like I said, forward, there are synonyms of forward. That's an easy way to do it. You can find those synonyms and write those synonyms down. And if any of those synonyms, I sound like I'm doing a tongue twister. But if there's any synonyms that you feel really catch your eye, I would write those down and mark them, put a star next to them. And another tip is to look at it in another language, not a random language. I'm not going to say use a random language. I'm going to say use a language that represents your brand. So for me, if I'm starting a business, I'm not going to use Japanese. Why would I use Japanese? I'm not Japanese. Well, the business I'm starting is not necessarily Japanese inspired. It might be. If it's Japanese inspired, then great, you can do that. But if it's just because you like Japanese, I wouldn't do that. But if you like the values of something that's Japanese, again, if it's a bonsai tree, for example, and you like the values of Japan and all that kind of stuff, and that you feel that connects with your idea, then by all means do that. But make sure what you're saying actually means what you think it's saying. Find someone that can actually speak the language and to give you the literal translation of something. For example, like Lego, like I said at the beginning of this episode, it was Danish. So like, if you're going to use another language, make sure you can either speak that language or find someone that can give you a literal translation of what those things are. But finding another language is actually, saying it in another language is actually quite effective as long as it suits the values that you are trying to project. And another tip on top of that is you can also combine words. Words can be combined to have multiple meanings. So I'm not going to give an example because I'll probably flop. But there are some examples. There's a on the internet, there's a lot of examples. I can't think of one at the top of my head right now. but you can combine words, the beginning and the end of certain words, to create a new word. And that's quite effective if it's done well, because that word probably doesn't exist. Now, this is the only time I feel like you can make up a word, when it's a combination of different words. So that kind of helps, because the URL might not be taken, for one thing. And it might not be trademarked, it might not exist. So if you can combine two words that mean something to you, that is quite an effective way to come up with a good brand name, if it's done well. But remember, it's got to roll off the tongue. Like, if it doesn't feel good to say, if it just sounds dead to say, it's not a good brand name, unfortunately. So yeah, I think just be careful when you do that, because you might think it sounds good, but it probably sounds it doesn't feel good to say. If it's not good, if it doesn't feel good to say. So but you can combine multiple words to create a new word with a new meaning. And the last thing you need to do, the last point I'm going to make, is that you need to check the trademark of these brand names. That is something that is super important, really, really important, because you could come up with a brand name and you could be very happy with this brand name, but you can't use it. Why? Because someone else has already trademarked that name and you can't do anything about it. Some names are great, but a lot of great names are taken because they're great. So go and check the trademark. Just Google it, how to check trademarks and whatever. You can find it. It's quite easy. And check if the name exists and what the trademark is for. Because sometimes the trademark isn't actually, sometimes it's expired sometimes. So you can actually, I think you can use it. Don't quote me on that. You might have to speak to a specialist on that. But check if that name is already being used by a company. The other thing, okay, I'm going to go off for the tangent, because the audacity of some people, yeah? How can you try and trademark a whole language? Like, how? Who the hell do you think you are? How can you this company tried to trademark, basically they had trademarked the word Yoruba, yeah? I was vexed when I heard about this, because how can you trademark a whole language? Pardon? A whole language that people speak, a whole culture, and you are not of this culture. This was I think it was an English company, and they trademarked the word Yoruba. Yoruba is the language that my people speak, and the dialect that my people speak in Nigeria. And the audacity to trademark Yoruba, and one other company had the word Yoruba in their name, and they tried to come for them and say, oh, you owe us money or something along those lines. And it's like, pardon? This you cannot trademark the word Yoruba. Like, it's mad. Some people are just insane. And after a lot of this is why I think bullying works sometimes, because on Twitter a lot of people came for them. They came for this company because just like, how can you, just because you think it sounds nice, And then their response is like, oh, we were protecting the name. The name doesn't need protecting. Like, at our expense, we were protecting the name. Piss off, bruv. Like, what are you talking about? Trademarking Yoruba. Anyway, there are some demons in this world. Anyway, go back to, I finished my tangent. But check the trademark. And on top of that, check the domain name. So go to somewhere like GoDaddy or 1&1 or whatever domain provider comes up in Google first, but check that the domain name exists, because again, you just like with the trademark, you'll find that a lot of names are already taken, and this happens a lot with like generic words. So if it's just like the other day, I think I checked for Black Star. I knew it was going to be taken because those are two very generic words. So, but it was taken. So you have to check that this word is not taken. And if it's taken, you can try an adaptation of the word. So if the word is taken, you can add the service next to it. So, you can add, I don't know, just imagine the word, I can't really think of a word right now, But take that first word and add the service next to it. So if the service is welding, or if the service is creative or whatever, add that service next to it, and that domain name might not be taken, but it might. So you might have to think of an entirely new name altogether. So I'm just going to recap on how to actually choose a good brand name. So the first thing you need to do is do your branding. Don't skip that. Secondly, you need to do your brainstorming. And when I say branding, I do not mean design. Please don't do that. Do your positioning, audience, all the values and all that. Make sure you have those down before you do any design. And I would say choose your brand. You have to choose a brand name before you do any design. People have come to me and said, can you design me a logo? And I'm like, what's the name of your business? And it's like, I don't have a name. I'm just like, how can I design a logo for you if you don't have a name? What am I designing then? Like, what the hell? This is real stuff. This is like, I could do an episode on real things that have happened to me. Like, people come up to me, they don't have a business name, but they want me to design a logo. What? I am baffled at some people. But anyway, do your branding first and then choose your brand name and then do your design, obviously. The next thing you need to do is brainstorm the words that represent your values from your branding, from that homework that you've done. Brainstorm the words that represent that. Then after that, the next thing you need to do is narrow down the best options from the brainstorm and find ways to say different ways to say them by using a thesaurus, Googling different things, try different languages and all that kind of stuff. And you can also combine, and then after that, narrow it down again, and then you can try combining different words and just try and choose the one that rolls off the tongue and represents your values the most accurately. And lastly, check the trademark and the domain name and see if it exists. And if it doesn't exist, buy it. It's not expensive to own a domain name. You can just own the name and not actually have the hosting. So buy that domain name, and when you can also trademark the name too. Well, yeah, that's it from me on this episode. Like I said, it's a fairly short episode because there's not much else to say about this topic. If you have any questions about what I've said, use the hashtag Unstuck Podcast or message me on Twitter or whatever at _Demi Harper. This is also on YouTube, so if you're listening on the podcast, you can check it out on YouTube. And if you're on YouTube, this is in podcast form. You can subscribe to the podcast. And make sure you subscribe and hit the bell if you're on YouTube as well, so that you don't miss another episode. So I'll be back again in 2 weeks, hopefully with a guest. And I hope you guys have a good couple of weeks and enjoy the sunshine if the sun is out. And get vaccinated, because I've done my first vaccination and I did not grow a tail, or I didn't turn into a titan. So yeah. I look forward to speaking to you again. Have a good one. Bye.